So let us look to the Lord in prayer. Dear Lord, we just thank you for this moment. Thank you, dear God, for allowing our lecturer to be here. Thank you for preparing him all these years for such a time as this. Lord, we just ask that the information we receive, let it nourish our minds and let us move forward with what you give us through this lecture. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Tonight, we're just thankful that you have joined us again, and we welcome you to the Faith, Health, and Justice Lectures, which is sponsored by the Gift Collaborative in collaborative model of two historic Black theological institutions, Howard University School of Divinity and Payne Theological Seminary. Tonight, we will hear a presentation on community partnerships and coalitions, and our lecturer is the Reverend Dr. John Robinson. He is an ordained minister, seasoned executive with 25 years of church and nonprofit leadership experience. He currently serves as the Senior Program Director at Metropolitan AME Church in DC, where he leads the Cities for Smart Surface Grant initiative. In this role, Dr. Robinson provides funding to churches and community based organizations across the country to innovate place based climate mitigation strategies and to advocate for ecological policy reform at the metropolitan area level. Let me let these persons in. Hold on. He also serves as the advocate for he also serves as the director of the Lilly Endowment $5 million national storytelling initiative on Christian faith and life. A dedicated leader in social enterprise, Dr. Robinson serves as the board chair for the Orcas Institute for Social Impact, which equips churches to address the systemic and social challenges they face, empowering them to harness their assets sets to sustain meaningful and social work impact. Dr. Robinson's academic background reflects his commitment to both organizational excellence and theological depth. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Management from Benedictine University, as well as a Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry degrees from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, where he currently serves on the Board of Trustees. Dr. Robinson has been married to the love of his life, Michelle, for 23 years, and they reside in Northern Virginia. So please be in prayer for the presentation from our lecturer, Dr. Robinson. Thank you, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you, Dr. Holly, and good evening to everyone. It is good to be in the land of the living, and it's good to be here in this season to talk about the power of partnerships and collaborations in a time where we are under assault. The very ideals we hold close, the values we have lived since before we were trafficked across the Atlantic. All of that, our way of life, our values, our perspective, our bodies, all under attack. And we're going to talk about how collaboration and partnerships can help us avoid and fight as our ancestors have always done and as the biblical record records. I want to first thank Dr. Holly for this invitation and for those at the Gift Collaborative who, for whatever reason, I don't look a gift horse in the mouth, but somebody thought it was a good idea to have me join you all this evening. And so we give God praise. I see the love of my life, Michelle, on the line, my colleague and friend from our days at Garrett, Dr. Barbara Fears, Dr. Kinney, and all of those whom I know and those I don't know, but I'm glad to see your faces. I'm glad to see your names in the little Zoom box. And so we're going to talk tonight about the strength of partnerships and collaboration in the fight against tyranny and in the fight against evil. Let me see if I can share my screen. Yes, Lord. So the subject or the title of our time together this evening is Abolishing Ecological Apartheid, Strategic Collaboration Toward Community Transformation. As Dr. Holly alluded to in the recounting of my bio, I am the Senior Program Director for Metropolitan AME Church in DC. Those of you who are news nerds like myself might recognize Metropolitan from the headlines recently, because we are the church that successfully sued the artists formerly known as the Proud Boys, not once, but twice. The first time we sued them, they decided they didn't need to pay because that's what narcissistic white supremacy does. So we sued them again, and the judge awarded all of the intellectual property, and I use intellectual in quotation marks, all of the intellectual property of the white supremacist organization now belongs to a Black church in DC. So we're the church that's not afraid to engage in battle with white supremacy, with evil in all of its forms. And we are situated in the belly of the beast, blocks away from the White House, which for almost 250 years, America is going to turn 250 years old this year, has stood as a symbol of oppression and tyranny for folk who look like me. So we are right there in the belly of the beast, doing battle the only way we know how, through the strength and power of our ancestors, and doing things collaboratively and in partnership. And so we're going to talk tonight about how we wage war against forces that are aligned against all of the values that we hold dear. To set the frame for the theological grounding and the scriptural basis, we're going to be walking through Nehemiah chapter 3 and 4. And then I'll talk about some of the work that we're engaged in that allows us to work out a modern day version of this kind of rebuilding and repairing work. Nehemiah chapter 3 says that Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananel. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zakur, son of Imri, built next to them. And then in chapter 4, we find this very powerful verse that is often quoted. So we rebuilt the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. So Nehemiah chapter 3 gives us the background of the chronicling of the rebuilding efforts. What's important to note in chapter 3 is the detailed sequential listing of the builders and their sections moving around the wall's perimeter. This was work that could not have possibly been done by one household or by one individual. And so we see the detailed list of those who built and the sections moving around the wall's perimeter. The people of Jerusalem are just back from exile. The temple had been destroyed. The city was laying in ruins. In chapter 2, Nehemiah, who was cupbearer to the king, was in the presence of the king, and the king remarked to Nehemiah that your countenance is down. Why are you so sad? And Nehemiah says to the king, with fear and trembling, because anytime you address the king was cause for consternation and concern, Nehemiah says, why should I not be sad when the city that I love, my home, is in ruins? And then the king asks a very profound question to Nehemiah, what then do you ask? And Nehemiah lays out the vision for the restoration of the city. What's also important to note in this particular passage is that in the 32 verses in chapter 3, the phrase or the refrain, and next to him, next to them, after them, is repeated 31 times in 32 verses. And that is significant because as we think about the entire context of this conversation, collaboration and partnership, no one built by themselves. Everyone had a section, and everyone had work to perform, and they did that work in concert and in parallel. And so we see 31 verses or 32 verses, 31 times the phrase, and next to him or next to them or after them, letting us know that this work was done in concert. There's some theological themes that emerge from chapter 3 as well. The priest as participant. It's important to note that the high priest, Eliashib, was not a delegator in this process. He was not on the sidelines spectating and supervising, telling the folk what they ought to be doing, but he led the effort to restore, and he was in the process working alongside of them. For those of us in church leadership, this is instructive because if we're going to be engaged in the kinds of partnerships that rebuild and restore, we need to be getting our hands dirty as well. So the high priest, the senior pastor, the bishop, the district supervisor, the presiding elder, is in the trenches with the people, getting his hands dirty. And it also establishes the fact that the restoration here, while indeed physical, was also spiritual in nature. As much as it was political, as much as it was military, as much as it was physical, this rebuilding project was also sacred and spiritual, which leads to the second point, which is that consecration and sacredness of ordinary tasks, the mundane. What happens on a random Tuesday? We in the church devote a lot of effort and energy to Sunday morning and planning for worship. And the high holy days, we are one Sunday removed from Easter, the highest of holy days in the church. And we give a lot of attention to those sacred, elevated, high, holy, exalted days. But the real work of rebuilding, the real work of restoration happens in the mundane and the ordinary. And so we see that in the high priest getting involved and getting his hands dirty, that the entire work, the entire project is consecrated beyond mere carpentry and stonework. This work is holy. Anytime God commissions people to rebuild and to restore and to repair, that is holy work. It is sacred work. It is spiritual work. And in this particular passage, it is also communal in nature. God did not tell Nehemiah, God did not even tell Elisha, the high priest, to go do this work by yourself. But Nehemiah had a vision. In chapter 2, Nehemiah goes out and surveys the land, does the site analysis, the community needs assessment, all of the things that we do in community, and brings back the vision and the plan for building and restoration. And so that's chapter 3. In chapter 4, the work, chapter 3 outlines and details the work of rebuilding the wall. And in chapter 4, we get opposition to God's divine and sacred work, which is not only prophetic, but also particularly poignant in this season, where we are building, we are trying to repair communities, and there is tremendous opposition. And the opposition in this text was verbal with the threat of violence. In our context, there's not just a threat of violence, there's actual violence. There's violence throughout the legacy of our time here on these shores. If we start the clock at 1619, we know that there were Africans here before 1619, but for the sake of this conversation, we can start the clock at 1619. For 407 years, there has been violent opposition to our efforts to build and to sustain and to repair and to restore. Whether it's Tulsa, Oklahoma, Wilmington, North Carolina, Rosewood, Florida, a host of other places, whether it's a white supremacist walking into Mother Emanuel AME Church in 2015, or over policing of our communities on April 13th, 2026, there's been violent opposition to the work of rebuilding and restoring and building that God has consecrated us to do. So the response to that opposition, the response to the threats of violence for Nehemiah and Elisha, the high priest, and all of the lineage that's outlined in chapter 3 is prayer and preparedness. The community prays, the community armed themselves. Scripture records that they built with one hand while holding weapons in the other. And you all can do with that what you will on April 13th, 2026. Metropolitan works with one hand and a lawsuit in the other. We're not afraid to fight. Other churches arm themselves in other ways. Other institutions, theological educational institutions, arm themselves in other way when grant funding is threatened if you don't scrub language that alludes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Payne Theological Seminary and Howard Divinity have had to be creative and fighting in other ways. And so we arm ourselves, we pray, and we encourage one another. And in chapter 4, verse 6, we see the climactic moment of progress where scripture records that the people had a mind to work and the walls were rebuilt in a very short period of time to half of their height, which indicates success and a measure of completeness, even though we know that God's work of building is never fully complete. But this marks tremendous progress in a very short period of time. So there was a concentrated plan executed by a number of people. There were guards who were given rotation schedules. That means that they patrolled the area to make sure that what was threatened in the first few verses was not actually carried out and that the work and the progress was not stopped. And so God empowers us through community. Again, this is not a solo narrative. This is not a solo act, but the work succeeds because the people collectively and individually devoting themselves to the task that they were assigned, but collectively had a mind to work, or the New Revised Standard Version says they had a heart to work. We also see the power of a unified purpose. The word shavar in Hebrew literally means joined together. I'm going to suggest not just that there's a physical connection or that the physical work was being done, but there was also spiritual and communal unity. So as we prepare, and as I prepare to walk you through a practical example of how this is playing out, not only in the life of Metropolitan AME Church, but in communities across the country, I want us to consider this question. And I'm going to give you about 60 seconds to write in your journal or type in your keyboard, notebook, however you record notes, notebook, journal, whatever the case may be. In light of this passage of scripture that we've walked through, and we know Nehemiah, we've preached it, we've taught Bible studies on it, we've heard sermons. So in that context, with the backdrop of Nehemiah and the collective building and restoration work that the people engaged in your community, where are the places that need to be rebuilt, restored, and or repaired? In your community, wherever you reside, and it can be where your church is located, it can be where you live. If those places are the same, then even better. Where are the places in your community that need to be rebuilt, restored, and or repaired? And I'll give you a minute or so to reflect on that question and to write your answer down. So as Dr. Holly alluded to in her introduction, Metropolitan AME Church is an abolitionist church. We accomplish much of our abolition work through collaboration. Over the past 3 years, we have been in partnership with the Smart Surfaces Coalition. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but we have been engaged in climate action, direct climate action work, attempting to do something about the extreme temperature disparity that exists in historically redlined neighborhoods relative to wealthier, typically white, verdant, tree-lined, full of green infrastructure neighborhoods, where in some cases that temperature disparity, as in the case of Dallas, Texas, that disparity is 20 degrees different. So same time of day, you go to a neighborhood in Dallas that's historically redlined, it might be 118 degrees. And in the part of town where the Cowboys play, it could be as low as 98 degrees. Exact same time of day. And a lot of that is driven by policy decisions, and we'll walk through that as well. So the Smart Services Coalition is a collection of organizations aligned around a common vision, much like the people were aligned in Nehemiah, around addressing extreme heat and the disparity between historically underrepresented, underserved, under-resourced, redlined communities and wealthier communities where infrastructure investments have been made. So these organizations that you see on the screen include the National League of Cities, Trust for Public Land, the American Public Health Association, REACT for Environmental Justice, the Oikos Institute for Social Impact, the Columbia Law School Sabin Center for Climate Change, the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and others. All of these organizations have been charged with working on two parallel tracks. On one track is policy work at the city level, working with folks in city offices of sustainability or resilience and departments of transportation, in some cases, city council, the mayor's offices, working to effect policy around what we call smart surfaces, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. And then on the parallel track, the work that Metropolitan has been leading, along with American Public Health Association, is providing grant funding to churches and small community-based nonprofits so that they can innovate place-based climate adaptation and mitigation projects. In other words, building green infrastructure projects in neighborhoods that are characterized as urban heat islands. So in the 6 cities where you see boxes, red boxes around the name of the city, Metropolitan has provided a little over $700,000 over the last 3 years in grant funding to churches and nonprofits in these cities. I'll talk about one of those cities, New Orleans, as a case study in just a minute. But again, the purpose of this project at a macro level is to resource churches, faith-based organizations, nonprofits around innovating green infrastructure projects that will help mitigate the extreme and deleterious effects of extreme heat and the disparity, the temperature disparity of heat islands. So what are smart surfaces? I'm glad you asked. Smart surfaces are infrastructure strategies that reduce urban heat and stormwater vulnerability while ensuring health, climate, and equity benefits. So if you look at the average urban landscape, the average urban environment, it is covered in dark, heat-absorbing, impervious concrete and asphalt. Smart Surfaces says we need to rip out all of that infrastructure and replace it with cool roofs, with green roofs, with porous, permeable pavements. In some cases where it makes sense, solar, cool pavements, green infrastructure like trees and rain gardens and parks, low and zero carbon concrete, and combinations of all of those for a holistic, comprehensive suite of services and interventions that can do something about the extreme temperature disparities that too many people, tens of millions of people, live with on a daily reality. So the case study that I want to walk us through tonight, and then we'll have a conversation about how this works, is a small nonprofit called Healthy Community Services in New Orleans that was formed in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina almost 20 years ago. So Katrina was 21 years ago this year. Around 2007, Dr. Angela Chalk started this small grassroots nonprofit that addresses these three pillars of coastal resilience, stormwater management, and urban agriculture. She started this nonprofit in collaboration with other entities in New Orleans, in part because the way that the response to Katrina unfolded, and many of you all are old enough to remember the debacle that was the federal response, including but not limited to FEMA and its ineptitude. She started this nonprofit because she recognized that if they were going to survive, if she was going to survive in the 7th Ward, which is one of the wards that was most impacted, along with the 9th Ward in New Orleans, that they were going to have to take matters into their own hands, that they could not wait for the city, could not wait for the state of Louisiana, and certainly could not wait for FEMA under the Bush administration to do the work of rebuilding and repair. And so much like Nehemiah in our text, Dr. Chalk got together, got to work to rebuild and to repair and to restore her. And it started with just her little plot of land that where her house sits, but has spread throughout the 7th Ward. And we'll talk about how that has worked over the last couple of years with our partnership. So to ground us in reality about what New Orleans is, and I don't know if there's anybody on this call from New Orleans. I'm sure some of us have been to New Orleans. This is what New Orleans looks like after an hour or so of rain. This looks like it could be photographic evidence of Noah and the ark, and that it may have rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but this is about 60 minutes of rain. And this is what it looked like in the neighborhood where Healthy Community Services primarily operates and where their executive director and founder, Dr. Angela Chalk, lives. So this is the reality for residents in this community every time it rains. I'll talk about why this is the case in a minute, but I want you to keep this picture in your mind as we talk about how we got here. And there's no singular answer to that, but there are a couple of key policy decisions that unfolded in the 20th century that I think are critical for our understanding and for this conversation. So the first is what we commonly know as redlining, how neighborhoods were literally divided up in the wake of the National Housing Act of 1934 and the creation of the Federal Housing Administration in 1934. Neighborhoods were carved up, maps were pulled out, lines were drawn, and decisions were made about who could live where, quite literally. And then those neighborhoods were given a grading scale from A to D. A, of course, like the grades that many of your students at Payne and at Howard Divinity receive on their tests and papers and assignments. A meant excellent, it was best neighborhood, seen as a worthwhile and worthy investment opportunity. And then the grading scale degraded from there, with D neighborhoods being deemed hazardous, literally hazardous. Mortgages denied, families prevented from buying, insurance denied, credit denied, infrastructure decisions, or I should say lack thereof, decisions about whether or not to build parks, whether or not to build stormwater infrastructure. And in the case of New Orleans specifically, that picture of New Orleans underwater is the direct result of stormwater infrastructure not being built in some places, in some parts of the city, while it was installed and put in other cities, other parts of the city. So the legacy of redlining largely not only created these dangerous, in some cases, really dangerous neighborhoods where life expectancies are shorter, where wealth is the wealth gap is wide, health, social determinants of health are on the wrong end of the scale. All of these things are the result of that, but it also largely locked Black families out of home ownership, which has been primarily the vehicle by which wealth, at least at the family level, has been generated in this country. And so you lock folks out of income and wealth opportunities, while at the same time exposing them to dangerous environmental conditions. And so that's part one, or one pillar, of how we got to New Orleans underwater every time it rains. The second policy pillar, and I would argue, in fact, one of the reasons why I talk about this in the terms of abolishing ecological apartheid is because much of what we experience is the result of public policy. Public policy that created redlining, public policy that created opportunity zones in some places and denied those same opportunities in others. The same policy legacy that created the federal highway system in New Orleans and across the country, that took what was at the time the oldest and wealthiest Black community, the Tremaine neighborhood of New Orleans, and ran Interstate 10 directly through the middle. In fact, right down what was what could be considered Main Street Tremaine, North Claiborne Avenue. In the 1950s, the Dr. Chalk, who is the executive director of Healthy Community Service, talks about being a child and hearing her family talk about, we have to move out of our house because the highway is coming. So this highway not only bisected the community, but it displaced residents, displaced businesses. The economic and wealth loss cannot be calculated. Black-owned businesses shuttered, local jobs lost, homes lost. And then you've got this toxic highway that emits all kinds of emissions and poison into the air. The runoff creates and leads to flooding, which is how you get that picture that I shared earlier. So all of these cascading impacts from redlining in the 30s and the federal highway system beginning in the 50s and into the 60s, this is the foundation, the backdrop for how New Orleans ends up underwater with an hour or so of rain. So the crisis is ecological apartheid. Historically redlined neighborhoods covered in impervious asphalt, which traps heat and creates flooding, and systemic underinvestment, which leaves vulnerable communities facing frequent low-impact disasters. You all may recall that Hurricane Katrina was not a Category 5 storm. Hurricane Katrina was a Cat 3. The devastation of Katrina was not from the fierceness of the storm, but by the failure of the infrastructure. Not only the failure of the levees, but the failure of the stormwater management system, the pump stations, the sewage, all of that old gray infrastructure failed the 7th Ward, failed the 9th Ward, and that was not by accident. So the crisis, ecological apartheid. The vision is restorative resilience, which boils down to reflective smart surfaces as opposed to the impervious asphalt that our communities are typically covered in, permeable infrastructure, green infrastructure, which absorbs excess stormwater and restores soil, restores the watershed, and transforming vacant lots into green spaces and ecological and economic engines of green workforce development and urban agriculture. So I'll go back to this picture. I want us to keep this in the forefront. We talk about the power of collaboration and the power of partnerships. Healthy Community Services, the executive director lives across the street from this lot. This lot is not the kind of place that anybody would want to live next to or across the street from. But this is the reality for tens of millions of people who have been forced into and redlined into neighborhoods just like this. So from 2005, when Katrina devastated the 7th and 9th wards and other parts of the city, until about 2023, this lot looked just like this. Almost 20 years. Disused, vacant, eyesore, blight on the community, in some cases dangerous because people were throwing things that ought not to be thrown outside on this lot. And so the community got together and decided they wanted to do something to transform this space. And it was a communal effort. Dr. Chalk held multiple listening and feedback sessions with the community, with residents, with business owners, with other stakeholders to determine the level of priority, because there are a lot of lots that look just like this in Treme. So which lot and what should we do with this? What then shall we do? A question that church folk often ask in the face of this kind of rebuilding and restoration work. So they brought in an architect, landscape architect design firm to produce this rendering that shows exactly what we mean when we talk about smart surfaces. You see around the exterior, the permeable pavers that allow water to seep into the ground as opposed to pooling and collecting and flooding. In the middle, you see green infrastructure, native plants that upcycle some of the water, as well as provide beautification and other health benefits. In the background, you have solar panels. And so this, and then to the right in the background, you see planter boxes. So this is a vision of a community resilience hub, a place that will allow for stormwater to be captured and rerouted so that it does not lead to flooding, a place where people can get mental health benefits as well as other health benefits because it reduces pollution and it just provides, it certainly looks better than that vacant lot. So on the left, you see the baseline, impervious, neglected, contributing to neighborhood runoff, contributing to neighborhood blight. And on the right, you've got the vision, the engineered vision, 1,500 square feet of permeable space designed specifically to mitigate localized flooding. So how did it go? This is the anatomy of transformation. The first phase, and this is, again, talking about the beauty and the strength of partnership, Healthy Community Services and Groundwork New Orleans built the framework and the infrastructure for this garden. You can see on the left this concrete that went as far as 2 feet deep that had to be excavated. And so the cost of that and the task of that was not something that Dr. Chalk certainly could do by herself, or even one or two people. The entire community got together, led by Groundwork, who's got expertise in doing this kind of work, excavated and put in a base layer. They removed the existing impervious materials and laid a highly permeable gravel foundation. And then they put in a structural framework that allows for, and I'll show you the next picture, that has the stormwater management system so that when the rain comes, it has somewhere to go. So you can see the PVC piping. You can see the underneath the surface, the complex root system. So that water now has somewhere to go. And that which is not able to be upcycled by the plants is rerouted out to the sewer system. So this is the almost finished version, about at this point, 90% finished. They did exactly what was recommended. They put in the permeable pavers, they've got green space, the native plants in the middle, upcycle water, and then that which is not able to be upcycled is run through that system and rerouted so that flood does not pool. There's a bird feeder. So what has happened in this particular space is that native birds have begun to come back to this neighborhood and to this garden. Butterflies, it's a butterfly sanctuary now. Bees are beginning to pollinate. And you've got, of course, the native plants that are growing. And then to the right in the back, the same location as envisioned in the architect's rendering, you have planter boxes that folks are able to plant small herbs and small vegetables. And it's a community garden as well as a rain garden, and multiple benefits. And then the solar panels allow for about 100 hours of power in the event of a power outage, which is also a common occurrence in a grid that's overtaxed in New Orleans. And that often experiences failures because of extreme weather events. I remember hearing people talk about Katrina as a once in a generation storm. And in the last 20 years or so, that once in a generation storm seems to be happening at least once a year, if not more frequently. So we're not only seeing increased frequency, but increased intensity of these kinds of storms. So a resilience hub like this allows for residents to come, charge phones, charge medical devices, charge to keep medicines cool, refrigeration, things of that nature, so that people are not perishing every time it rains or every time there's an extreme storm. So this again is the baseline. And this is the finished product, architect's rendering on the left, the actual garden on the right. I might be a little biased because we had a little something to do with this garden, but I think the actual looks better than the envision, but that's just me. So a week before I visited this garden for the first time, you can see this is the garden. That same rainstorm that I showed you the first picture. The garden was underwater, essentially, like much of the community, but because the infrastructure was already in place, within about 2 to 3 hours, it went from this to this because the infrastructure did what it was designed and built to do. So the living blueprint is realized, and this garden is able to capture 10,000 gallons of rainwater per storm event. So anytime it rains, and it rains quite frequently in New Orleans, this garden is able to capture 10,000 gallons and reroute it so that you don't get the same flooding that was depicted in that picture. Second project I want to go through real quickly, and then we'll open it up for some conversation. The first thing that I noticed when I looked at this picture is I-10. And that highway is I-10. It literally runs parallel to North Claiborne Avenue. which is Main Street Treme. For 40 or so years, this underpass that has now been turned into a pocket park and a rain garden was a toxic dumping ground. The businesses, the city, everybody was dumping their trash underneath this underpass. And so again, with collaboration from Healthy Community Services, Groundwork New Orleans, the Greater New Orleans Foundation, and other organizations, they transformed this blighted, toxic, dangerous space into a beautiful park that, again, serves functional and practical purposes as well. In addition to the beautification, this is another rain garden that captures tens of thousands of gallons of storm water to prevent flooding in a place where flooding is common. So, rebuilding from ancient Jerusalem to modern New Orleans. We've walked through Nehemiah's vision and the power of united purpose. We've talked about how they collectively did more than any one of them could have done individually. And we've drawn some parallels between that and modern day New Orleans and the work, the rebuilding, the restoration, and the repair work that's happening in New Orleans. The difference between Nehemiah and New Orleans is that you could argue that we are still in exile. We have not yet returned to the place from which we were captured. And nevertheless, we have attempted to build, we have attempted to make a life for ourselves and for our families. And at every turn, there's been opposition for us like there was for Nehemiah. And nevertheless, we persist. We engage in modern day struggles. We persist in our struggle to build something that is a benefit to ourselves and to our children and our children's children. And through efforts like the work being led by Dr. Chalk in New Orleans and other cities, we have provided grant funding to over 30 organizations over the last 3 years to do similar projects as this in cities like New Orleans and Atlanta and Charlotte, Dallas, San Antonio, Jacksonville, all of which face their own unique challenges, but also have some commonality in that public policy has led to exile-like conditions for folk who have a little more melanin in their skin. The macro benefit of all of this type of work that is, again, done in partnership and in collaboration is that if enough of those small infrastructure projects are put in place, if there's investment in small rain gardens and small bioswales and small community gardens and small parks, that eventually that work will filter out to the entire watershed and build a more resilient New Orleans, a more resilient Jacksonville, a more resilient DC, a more resilient wherever city. Because true resilience is not built from the top down, but from the planter box to the shoreline. In the same way that Nehemiah's work was grassroots from the bottom up, the work of rebuilding in our time is the same. It has to be done from the community outward and not from the top down. Top down is how we got in the condition that we're in. But grassroots collaboration and coordination is how we make macro and micro transformation. So a closing thought, closing meditation comes from Isaiah chapter 58, where we find these words: "The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. So before I open it up for a conversation, you considered a few moments ago what places in your community need repairing, restoration, and rebuilding. On that same piece of paper and that same digital journal entry, I want you to respond to this question. How has God uniquely gifted you to repair the breaches in your community? I'm going to give you a minute to ponder that thought, and then I'll open it up for conversation. How has God uniquely gifted you to repair the breaches in your community? All right, let's have some conversation. Questions, reactions, comments to what I have shared.
I do have a question.
Dr. Hardy. Yes,
Fantastic presentation. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
But you were saying that there was a pocket park underneath I-95. What exactly is a pocket park?
So it's essentially what I showed, and that's under I-10 in New Orleans. So a pocket park is a small park. So we call it pocket because it's small. So it's not like Grand, what's the park in New York that they stole from Black people? Central Park. It's not Central Park. It's not millions of acres. It's a small space that incorporates tree canopy. So one of the drivers of that extreme temperature disparity is a lack of green infrastructure, lack of tree canopy. So where there are no trees, you get extreme heat.
Yes.
Where there are no trees, you also get higher rates of crime. And there have been multiple studies that show the direct link between tree canopy and crime. Where there are no trees, you get higher instances of respiratory disease. Where there are no trees, you get lower mortality rates, or higher mortality rates, lower life expectancy rates. And so a pocket park is just a small space that's been carved out, much like that underpass underneath I-10, where you put in some green infrastructure. So they've got trees, they've got native plants that they've planted. There was a walking path. I can show it again. Let me share it again so I can show you what we're talking about.
Okay.
Okay, so you see the trees. And on the picture on the right, these are native plants that really they serve the purpose of almost like an ecological or natural sponge. So these plants soak up water that would normally just collect and puddle and pool. You can see the trees, the grass, right? So this is, when we talk about a pocket park, it's really just a small park. This is one block of land underneath I-10. I-10 stretches for miles across New Orleans. And so this is an example of what can be done at a grassroots level. And the hope is that other organizations in New Orleans and other organizations have already sort of responded to the call to do similar projects. I should also add at this point that Healthy Community Services, which is the organization we provided grant funding to, has done 4 of these kinds of projects in 2 years.
Oh.
the smaller garden across the street from the executive director and founder's house that I showed is one. This is another, and they've done two other projects that are similar, that have similar functional benefits. They've also planted over 100 trees, because again, tree canopy is tied to so many things, so many other benefits that are derived just from having tree canopy. And again, decisions about tree canopy. So if we go to a place where all of us are familiar with the terminology or phrasing concrete jungle, right? Are we to believe that as God was handing out trees, that God got to places like Treme and Trenton, New Jersey, and Southeast DC and said, you know what, I'm out of trees. I ain't got no more for these people. No, these are public policy, intentional, deliberate decisions.
Yes.
Made by folk, made by politicians, made by policymakers who have said those Negroes essentially don't deserve trees.
Trees, right.
They don't deserve parks. They don't deserve all of these other things that other wealthier neighborhoods, those A neighborhoods going back to the 1930s, carving up of our neighborhoods. And so these are intentional decisions. So I characterize this work not only as abolishing ecological apartheid, but this is resistance work at its finest. The city has said for generations, Treme does not deserve, does not get XYZ, whether it's trees, green spaces, stormwater infrastructure, and residents and other stakeholders are saying, we don't care what y'all talking about. We're gonna build our own. So the devastation has happened, and the parallels, the parallels between Nehemiah and the rebuilding work that took place in that passage and what's happening in New Orleans and some of these other cities, led by grassroots efforts. The parallels are everywhere. And it is an act of resistance, often in the face of tremendous and violent opposition. All right, a great question. Great question. Thank you for that, Dr. Hardy. Any other questions? Any other conversation? Did that make sense? Did I just waste y'all time?
Oh no, Dr. Robinson, you definitely
help a brother. I'm a Black preacher now. I got to have feedback.
you definitely did not waste our time. I just want to comment, and then I want to ask the question. I mean, this is so. This shows how faith, health, and justice collaborate together, and I appreciate you using Nehemiah chapters 3 and 4, and then you gave us from the biblical. Then you went into the practical, and I appreciate, from the biblical, the theological, and the practical. And I appreciate this. I just have a question. How were the engineers chosen to do this great work?
How were the engineers chosen?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a great question. The short answer is that Dr. Chalk and her team, Dr. Chalk is born and raised in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. She lives across the street from the primary garden that I walked you all through. Mm-hmm. She has a network of connections that rivals anybody that you all know who you think is connected. They chose partnerships based on who had community trust, who was competent to do the job. Because that's the other thing. A lot of people come into communities wanting, with all these great and grandiose promises about what they're going to do. Yes. and how the community is going to benefit. And then not only does the community not benefit, oftentimes the community is in worse shape than it was when these people showed up. So they chose groundwork because this is what groundwork does. And in terms of the actual infrastructure and putting that, the infrastructure of that garden, groundwork, that's what they do. And the person who runs the program at Groundwork in New Orleans, and I should add at this point, Groundwork is a national organization that has little local chapters, for lack of a better term. So the person leading the work in New Orleans not only does this work, because that's just what they do, but they also have a workforce development program that trains young youth and young adults to be able to do this work. So those young men in the picture that I showed you that were putting it in, those were young adults, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, getting paid a living wage and getting practical on-the-job experience in installing a rain garden. And now they're all over the city doing similar projects, right? And so that's when we talk about a vision of communal restoration, it's not just one thing. It's all of the things, or as scripture would put it, as Paul said, in all things, God working together for good, right? So you have faith, you have health, you have, in an ideal world, you have policymakers, and there are some policymakers. I don't mean to disparage everybody that's in policy. You have some policymakers of goodwill and good conscience who collaborate and lend their resources where and when they can. And so in a perfect world, you've got all of it working together. You've got the policy front where just and equitable ordinances and legislation is working. You've got the business community, you've got residents, you've got the nonprofit sector, you've got the faith sector, you've got the health sector, all of it working together. And the reason I chose New Orleans out of all of the different places that we were doing work is because you've got us close to a complete coalition with this project, as I have found in doing this work over the last 3 to 4 years. You've got the partnership with the Louisiana Public Health Association, which is the Louisiana branch of the American Public Health Association. They have worked together with Dr. Chalk in Healthy Community Services to quantify and educate about the health benefits of green infrastructure. You've got the business community, the lot. I can share this with y'all because, we family. So that vacant lot was bought at auction by a gentleman who is colloquially known as Mr. Bullitt. Mr. Bullitt is the owner and proprietor of Mr. Bullitt's Bar and Grill, which is not only an establishment where you can get food, but back in the day, some of the greats, including Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan, performed out of Mr. Bullitt's. So it's a place you can go and listen to some live music, get some good food, a few libations, if that's what you're into. Mr. Bullitt bought that lot at auction and then leased it to Dr. Chalk. So you have all of these different stakeholders coming together, working together to improve and beautify and restore and rebuild and repair that block. And it started with one block. Started with Dr. Chalk's house, and then her neighbors, and I learn new wrinkles to the story every time she and I talk. Her neighbors looked at her lot and were wondering, well, how come your stuff ain't flooding and ours is flooding? And that's how it started. The green infrastructure she implemented in her own yard kept her yard from flooding. And everybody else wanted to know, how come your stuff ain't flooding, right? And so that has blossomed into this whole neighborhood-wide initiative where they've built 4 or 5 of these kinds of projects, planted 100+ trees, and are doing just tremendous work. I see Carmichael.
Yes, sir. Good evening, and thank you so much for your presentation. I'm wondering, and I think that you may have probably just answered a great deal of it. Here in the Richmond, Virginia area, we have a section of town that floods, historically floods, but we're also looking at doing some building of a museum in that area that would benefit the African American community as well as America as a whole to tell a complete story. I'm wondering, the plans that I've seen include some of these green spaces that you're referring to and bringing back the natural or the original, the indigenous plant life. But
Yes.
I'm wondering, at the same time, there seems to be this boom for rapid urbanization and the removal of green spaces.
Yeah.
And so, can you help me to understand how that works? And then because it seems like it's working at cross purposes. And
So
then, mhm,
I'm trying to give the Cliff's Notes version.
mhm,
But if you trace public policy back to 1492, when Columbus and the settlers stole the land, we've been at cross purposes.
okay.
And I don't mean to be glib about that, right? We have lived at cross purposes for 500 plus years,
Mhm,
in because there are competing priorities as it relates to development, particularly urban development, because now urban real estate all of a sudden is the hottest ticket in town. Now, when they were redlining us into urban spaces and grading our neighborhoods D, right? It wasn't hot. You couldn't touch it. Nobody wanted insurance. You couldn't get insurance. You couldn't get mortgages. But now it's the hottest ticket in town. And so there's cross purposes. There's cross purposes when billionaire owners hoodwink and bamboozle policymakers to subsidize stadiums
mhm,
without any kind of green infrastructure allowances.
right.
So there's the short answer to that is there's cross purposes all the time in the policy space. And so what I would say is I would celebrate the fact that this museum, that these plans include some green infrastructure elements. And I would lean into that and organize around making sure that that's preserved, because I don't know where what process that project is in terms of its completion. But plans have a funny way of changing. And you wonder where the meeting was and where the community feedback was elicited, and it wasn't, or it was perfunctory. They had already made a decision, and then they open up a town hall meeting and they've already decided what they're going to do.
Right.
So I would lean into that and organize around making sure that those kinds of things are improved. And this is where, I can put you in touch with Dr. Chalk, because in addition to the actual infrastructure implementation, she also is an advocate on the policy front.
Okay.
So she's in, and she's from Louisiana. Her representative is the current Speaker of the House. She's in his face probably more than his wife,
Okay.
demanding. And she's on the Hill in DC. She's at her state house, advocating for all of the kinds of things that we are talking about here. And so I would say, don't be alarmed at the cross purposes, because everybody has an agenda. The developers have an agenda. The politicians have an agenda. The politicians' primary agenda is to get reelected. And so they will do whatever they need to do to make sure they get reelected, because self-preservation is their default setting. And I would also figure out how to elevate the voice of the community in these processes. Dr. Chalk is very good at holding the city's feet to the fire, to the extent that one Black woman in often neglected and forgotten about neighborhood in New Orleans can hold people's feet to the fire. But she has a gift for it. And something she said to me that I think is true for all of us at varying degrees. She said, I cannot afford to get this wrong, because if I get this wrong, we won't be here.
Right.
So it's not philosophical, right? This is not a philosophical exercise. This is real for her and for the community and for a lot of our communities. So where you have leverage, figure out where that is. And so I think one of the reasons why Nehemiah is so powerful from a scriptural framing perspective is because everybody put their head down, right, literally and metaphorically, and did what was in front of them. Mm-hmm. The work that's in front of you, do that. And if you do that, and next to you, Dr. Hardy is doing the work that's assigned to her, and next to her, Dr. Fears is doing the work that's assigned to her, and next to her, Dr. Wade, and after Dr. Wade, Dr. Kenny, and after Dr. Kenny, Michelle, and after Michelle, Dr. Holly, right? That's how you go from micro to macro level rebuilding and restoration.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. Great question. All right, other questions? I saw Sister Wade had her hand up and then took it down. Maybe I was taking too long to answer the other question.
No, no, thank you so much.
Uh-oh. We lost her.
He'll be back.
Okay. All right, other questions, other reactions, other feedback?
Dr. Kenny.
Yeah, Dr. Robinson, first of all,
Yes,
thank you. Thank you for just a comprehensive and very informative.
Yes.
I learned a lot tonight. But one of the key things that stands out is the convergent relationality in all of the dimensions of the ecosystem.
Right.
And that, I noticed on the chart the health impact.
Yeah.
Once you start and you start disrupting the inherent and intrinsic relational principles in the system, there will be negative consequences for somebody. And and the other thing is that they are not ignorant of that reality. So that the decisions are not made in ignorance, but are indeed calculated and primarily driven by a mercenary nexus to engender profit and benefit. Now, in the case, and I don't know if Marquita is still there, I happened to visit one of the neighborhoods in Richmond that used to be predominantly Black, and that neighborhood is going through gentrification, is changing radically. But guess what they're doing? Planting trees, putting green spaces. And before, that was not, there was always a budgetary reason or some reason why you couldn't do it. As soon as the complexion of the neighborhood changed, they start doing it because they are acutely conscious of that element of the wellness of those people.
Yep.
And
so no, you're 100% correct. And one of the challenges, right, is to not allow ourselves to fall into the romanticism of the mythology of American exceptionalism. Is to have our eyes wide open, as you astutely observe, and to understand all of the things that we are up against. So it is not accidental. Part of what makes New Orleans unique is its literal physical geography, right? Parts of the city are literally below sea level, which means that any slight disruption to the status quo as it relates to sea levels or river levels was going to cause flooding, because the parts of the city are under sea level. And it just so happens, right, not coincidentally, as you are articulated, that Black folk were redlined into those low-lying underwater or under sea level parts of town, and all of the things that have come with that. So the only way to combat that is really the same way that Nehemiah and, you know, Elisha and the whole host of other folks chronicled in chapter 3. And that's to do it collectively. Do it together. We cannot fight this level of evil, this organized evil, in silos. And it gets to one of my great frustrations as it relates to the church folk, because you have every churches over here doing their own things, and there's not enough coordination and not enough collaboration. We won't even get into the whole denominational conversation, because that's another, that's a 5-hour session, and we ain't got time for that tonight. But all of us that are in religious spaces and are affiliated with a denomination know what I'm talking about. If we could just for a year do what Nehemiah did, I shudder to think what kind of transformation we might experience. Right, if we could channel the spirit of our ancestors in Montgomery, who for 381 days. Now, again, let's not act as if everybody in Montgomery was on board with the boycott. There were some folk who said, "Look, I don't care what they're doing. I got to get to work." Right, but there were enough of us. There was a critical mass enough that it crippled the mass transit system in Montgomery. If we could channel that spirit in 2026, eye hath not seen and ears not heard, neither has it entered into the hearts of God's children what God has prepared for those who love God. But thank you for that observation. Other questions? Our time is drawing nigh. Other comments, reactions, questions?
I don't hear any, Dr. Robinson.
I don't hear any either. So I guess
So truly,
I'll turn it to your hand. Back to your hands, Dr. Holly. And again, let me before you.
Hold on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Didn't you say there was a grant process?
A grant process?
Right, but you said they received a grant, right?
Who they? Yeah, are you talking about the New Orleans? Yes.
Yeah, right. Did you explain what that process was, how they obtained it?
I did not.
Would you?
So again, it's about relationships and network. So so let me back up. So as the person responsible for administering this grant program sitting in Washington, D.C., I was very cognizant and intentional about not going into New Orleans, not going into Jacksonville, not going into Dallas, and saying, we know what y'all need. So I began to look for organizations who had a track record. In some cases, New Orleans was a direct grant because of a relationship. Somebody said, you need to go check out Dr. Chalk and see what she's doing, and I did. And we had a couple of conversations, and I gave her a check. And I'll talk a little bit later, maybe, about one of my frustrations with the philanthropic industrial complex. That's another 5-hour session. So there were some cases where we released an RFP and organizations sent proposals. In this particular case, folk that I trust and know said that she good people, and then I've trusted and verified and wrote her a check. And I will say this, if I had more checks to write, she would be the first one I write them to, because they have done, there's an adage, Digital Underground and others have talked about people being adept at making $1 out of 15 cents. She making $1 out of 10 cents, 5 cents. And is doing it in the face of opposition. So I told you all she planted 100 trees. The city cut down every one of those trees with no explanation and no reforestation plan. That's another 5-hour session. I don't think we got 5 hours. Dr. Holly, you can invite me back for another 2-hour session and we can talk about that. But So the answer to your question is that's what you call trust-based philanthropy and relationship-based philanthropy. And that addresses one of my primary, I'll be nice and call it a pet peeve with the philanthropic industrial complex. All of us have have operated in this space, and have filled out a 10-page proposal for $5,000. So you got twice as many pages as you got thousands of dollars in the proposal. You working on about for every page you get about what? You get $1,000? Not even. You get $500 per page of time, energy, and effort spent responding to a proposal. When I was pastoring in Chicago, they had an anti-violence initiative. The entire anti-violence initiative was $1 million that they was going to give to like 5,000 organizations, and the process was tedious, long and tedious, like many of our Christian journey. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that's how that came. That's how that came about.
Minister Wade is back. Minister Wade,
Minister Wade.
here.
I'm sorry, I had a little bit of technical difficulty. Thank you so much for this conversation. I just wanted to say I was glad to be here and to receive the information, the framework, the strategy. And as I was listening to you speak, because you mentioned several times collaboration, and I think my initial question was, what are the 3 steps that you would advise to help initiate collaboration? But I believe you touched on it earlier when you talked about identifying resources where the individual was able to purchase the lot, and then, use leveraging our political influence. But if there's any more that you want to add to that, I would love to hear.
Sure. So there's an African proverb that says the best way to consume an elephant is one bite at a time. So when faced with a daunting challenge like Nehemiah in the biblical text, like New Orleans in the modern context, the task can seem overwhelming. So the first thing that I would advise is to respond to the first question that I asked you all to meditate on and reflect on. What are the areas in your community, in your church, in your organization, if you wanted to do it organizationally specific, that are in need of repair, restoration, and rebuilding? Then what are you uniquely qualified and equipped and anointed to do? Because I heard somebody today talking about, actually it was the woman who started and then eventually lost and then regained the vegan food chain, Slutty Vegan. And I cannot remember the sister's name, but she talked about having, the way she said it, I'm just going to say it like she said it. She said, I had football players on the soccer field. So talented people, gifted people, but they in the wrong sport.
Mm-hmm.
You great at football, but you got no business on the soccer field. So I say that to say it's not enough to just have talented people. It's not enough just to have gifted people. You have to have gifted and talented people who are properly aligned and positioned according to their gifts and talents, as was the case in Nehemiah, as has been the case in the practical example of New Orleans that I talked about. So what are the places where there are breaches that are in need of restoration and repair and rebuilding? And then what are you uniquely qualified in other words, what is your superpower? Because everybody got one, right? And then the New Testament epistolary example of that is the body, right? To some, God gave to be teachers and preachers and apostles and so on. So you got to have everybody working in concert, right? The body is another great example, or a great visual. My arms are they work when they want to work, and the older I get, the less they want to work. But my arms are not suited for every task. And these knees, sure enough, ain't suited. I can't think about one or two things these knees are suited for, but they're not suited for every task. So aligning the resources that you have according to their best use and God's intended use, I think is another thing. And then once you've done all of those things, then you begin the work of going out to find other organizations, other people who either have complementary gifts to yours or have totally different gifts, but that can be used to the same purpose and the same end. So in the case of Metropolitan and this Smart Services Coalition, we're all over the map in terms of the different organizations, right? You've got health, you've got research, you got a church, the only church in the coalition, but we all got grant funding, and we're all aligned towards the similar purpose of addressing extreme heat, but we all do it from a different lens. Metropolitan is doing deep community engagement work, and providing grant funding. World Resources Institute is looking at meteorological maps and like GIS data and satellite imaging. I couldn't decipher a satellite image if you gave me $1 million, right? But we all bring our different unique gifts to the table, and we're united in trying to figure out how do we make life better for tens of millions of people in these cities where public policy has created tremendous adverse conditions.
Dr. Robinson, I'm not going to put my face up because I have my hair washed, but
hey, my hair washed too. My hair is washed too.
I'm Dolores Brisbane, and I'm kind of with John Kinney, the originators of the Gift Collaborative. So on behalf of the organization, thank you for this presentation. And it's been a graduate course. There is so much to do in the Black community. So all of us need to take our piece and do what we do as we collaborate with each other. We came to collaboration among the historic Black schools because everybody was threatening that they were going to die. And Dr. Kinney and I decided that wasn't going to happen. And we were going to redefine what sustainability meant. We understand sustainability means enrollment and money, and we didn't have either of those. So it was going to take grit, and he taught me the theology, and I was the witch, W-I-T-C-H. The good witch, to find the funds to make this go. And I'm pleased to say, using our individual gifts, we've been at this now since 2015. So it has taken 10 years to get it upright and get people pay attention to us. And now people are asking, how can I fund you? Rather than I'm going to ask them, for funds. But it has been the strength of our authenticity. So here's to you, Pastor Wade. I think the question of how do you collaborate, have the direction, and refuse to have it changed by anybody. Everybody can do whatever they want to do, but you can't do it in this work because it has a focus. And to your question about how we can serve our community. COVID set us up because when we looked at the data of COVID and the numbers of people died, 60% of them looked just like us, and no one was doing anything about it. Right at the time that the Affordable Health Care Act was being attacked by the Republicans. And so we took on health as a justice issue. And then Dr. Holly did all the stuff she did to put it together, because it is America. For Black folk, healthcare is the justice issue. And if the White House remains as it is, if we have anything else, it'll just get worse, because they keep hitting at the one thing of the Affordable Health Care Act that covers more people that look like us than it does for other people. I'm old. I'm like 93 years old, and half of my life has been in healthcare. So there's not a soul alive who can tell me how bad Black people have been treated. So we have combined our need for our community to address an issue which some of us are uniquely qualified to do. So we don't try to do other folks' stuff, but your presentation is very encouraging that we can tack into something else with this global aspect of healthcare. So I'm very grateful. I go to bed about this time, but but I looked you up and I thought I want to hear what you have to say. So thank you so much for contributing to us this evening. And Dr. Holly can invite you back again. And maybe if I'm awake, I'll show up and hear you. So thank you so much for participating with us.
Thank you for your encouragement, for your sharp insight, but more than that, for your legacy of activism and for your vision in pulling this together. What you said alluded to caused me to think back again to Nehemiah, and in chapter 2, as the king is having a conversation with Nehemiah, the king asks King Artaxerxes, asks Nehemiah, what do you request? Right, so the king sees Nehemiah's countenance is sad. Nehemiah says, why wouldn't I be sad? My city is in ruins. And the king says, what do you request? And Dr. Brisbane, what you said is true and is going to be increasingly true as we deal with a wannabe king fascist tyrant. Others who are of goodwill, others who have resources are beginning to ask that same question. What do you request? They've asked it of Metropolitan. And my friend and pastor, Bill Lamar, is always ready with an answer. So to Reverend Wade, I think that would be the last thing I would say is when people ask you the question, what do you request? That you be ready with an answer. And that your answer is given in light of the context in which you reside or preside, and that it is in response to building, or rebuilding, repairing, restoring the breaches that exist and have existed since the settler colonials stole the land and then stole and trafficked our ancestors to work the stolen land. What do you request? We got to be ready to answer that question because resources are available. And I'm not talking about what I heard somewhere, what I read. Metropolitan has received millions of dollars in grant funding over the last 3 years to do various things. Because when people ask the question, what do you request? We got to answer for them. The other organization of which I'm affiliated, the Oikos Institute for Social Impact, led by Reverend Dr. Reginald Blunt, and his co-founder, Sidney Williams, who you all are no strangers to. When they asked Oikos the question, what do you request? We got an answer from them. And Oikos has also received tens of millions of dollars over the last few years to do social impact work in cities across the country. And it's building capacity. So Dr. Wade, if you are not familiar with Oikos, look up Dr. Reginald Blunt. And if you do know him, send him a text, call him, send him a smoke signal, carrier pigeon, message in a bottle, something. If I find some way to get some communication to Dr. Blunt, because they are helping congregations, helping faith leaders to build the capacity to answer that question and to do the work of rebuilding and restoration.
And their 2-day meeting is in September. So, Pastor Wade, if Dr. Holly has your
I did.
context, I'll make it easy for you to get in touch with Reggie.
Yes,
Yes.
please do.
Because
Please
we
do.
own part of him.
Yes.
You know, he's a collaborator with us. So I'd be happy to connect you to him. And I believe Dr. Fears or Pastor Fears or Reverend Fears, I'm not sure what your title is.
All of the above.
Okay, all of those things. I would say about grants, it's relationally driven. Grants are relationally driven. I mean, that's the key. If folk trust you, sort of, and if they like you, they'll try to figure ways of giving you money. And I'll give you this example. A young man that I mentored when we both were younger called me up and asked me what I was doing. And he told me that he had opened a business to coach foundation leaders. I said, I'm raising money, so introduce me to all of them. And even though the Gift Collaborative was not old enough yet, he put me in touch with Murdoch's president, who gave us a special award to do something that I could define, with the understanding that she'd fund us more once we were 3 years old. It had nothing to do with what we were doing. It was all because Gavin and I knew each other, and he introduced us to Romanita, who then introduced me to another organization that we have a grant before right now. So it really is relationally based.
Right, but I'm assuming you still had to submit some paperwork.
Yeah, sort of.
Okay, and that's my question.
Yeah, well, that's a process. The other thing is there are some funders who invite proposals, but you have to help them understand to invite you.
That's my question to my friend.
Right. Yeah. You have to say, you really do need to ask me to take your money to do work. Then you fill out the paper to do it. You're correct. You do have to fill out the paper. We just submitted probably about 200 pages this morning.
Oh, great.
All right. So, but if we don't have enough paper, Dr. Kenny can write enough to I can make 10, he can make 110, and we can put it in and get it together, because only we know the content. Okay, so I do think that funding is based on, in these larger groups, relationships. Somebody introduce you to somebody else, you tell them about your work, and it grows.
Okay, that's helpful. Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's it. And I'll add to that. When it's relationship based, and Dr. Brisbane is 100% correct. Unfortunately, that relational capital has often not extended to us, but those pathways are opening for us, in large part because when we get resources, we not only do what we say we're gonna do, but we do exceedingly and abundantly above all that you can ask or imagine.
Right.
So they're like, oh, well, how did you manage to do all of this with this? And we said, this is what we've been doing since before we got over here. That's why y'all brought us over here. So we know how to make $1 out of 15 cents. So yes, paperwork is involved, But when it's relationship based, in the way that my relationship with Dr. Chalk has evolved, it is, Dr. Chalk, I need you to tell me what you would do with $100,000 and send me no more than 2 pages.
Yeah, I think the paperwork is often to say what you did. That doesn't necessarily get the money. And it's more for your own documentation and maintenance of authenticity than the funder. Because I can tell you, our largest funder doesn't read what we send.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah,
so know
and
that. I just so know that because they can never return it to me when I'm talking to them. So it ends up I'm repeating stuff all the time, over and over and over again. I'm not a theologian, Dr. Kinney, but I have learned sort of how to be repetitive in sermonizing, that you need me to do this with your money. So just give it to me and I will do it. But that's out of having developed a relationship with folk that I just say what I mean. I do that with everyone, but I am very deliberate about that with the funders. And you can do that, all of the above fears.
Thank you.
And let me say that the foundation of relationship is integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
You have to be trustworthy, and you have to be persistent in and passionate about your vision and your goals and outcomes. And even when you don't have money, you act like you do. In other words, I will not allow my lack to establish the limit of my dream and my commitment to possibility. And sometimes that your energy can energize somebody who doesn't have energy and open some things. But I cannot emphasize enough the role of integrity in person and in organizational practice. I've discovered when you lack integrity, what you get from people, you get it from people who lack integrity.
I'm gonna just let that rest.
Absolutely.
Well, truly, I thank all of you for participating in this beautiful dialogue. And Dr. Robinson, we will definitely invite you back. And thank you so much, Queen Mother, for your input. That's Dr. Dolores Brisbane. We call her Queen Mother, for those of you who didn't know that. So we will say thank you to everyone. The presentation will be put up on the Gift Collaborative YouTube website, and you can see it hopefully in 2 or 3 days. So thank you everyone for your participation, and have a good rest of the evening.